Good morning from Brazil. It's 8 o'clock here, and welcome to this wonderful webinar. WICAPHD is very happy to be co-sponsoring this webinar that mark our initiatives to have the Infant, Child, and Adolescent Mental Health Day. Today, we will have with us our past president, Professor Daniel Fung, who will be the chair of this initiative. As you all know, trauma is a very challenging and difficult issue that our children and adolescents and infants face during their life in different situations worldwide. So I'm very happy with the program that Professor Daniel Fung was able to organize for this morning for us. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. And well, as you greet everyone, good morning from Brazil. I greet you all from Singapore, the other side of the world, where it is now 7 p.m. And actually waiting for this webinar to end so I can have my dinner. But anyway, that's part of life on the global stage, everyone. So welcome everyone again. Let's see if I can move my slides. Today is the 23rd of April, World Infant, Child, Adolescent Mental Health Day. We started this this day last year, and today is the second time we are celebrating this important occasion where we want to put focus on infant, child, and adolescent mental health. Now, I was told I will have 2 minutes, but in my usual fashion, my 2 minutes could be a bit longer in this part of the world. The theme that we all decided on is to stand against infant, child, and adolescent trauma, because trauma is such an important issue. Now, for the topic, we have three eminent speakers from different parts of the world, sharing on war, on disaster, as well as victims of trauma for children and how what's the mental health response that's needed. We will subsequently have a panel discussion with our 4 representative organizations that have come together to recognize this World Infant, Child, Adolescent Mental Health Day. The International Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Allied Professions, which you've heard from our president, Luis Roda. We also have the International Society of Adolescent Psychiatry and Psychology. And we have Mario Speranza, who is the president, with us today. And we have the World Association of Infant Mental Health, where Campbell Paul is representing as president. And we also have, last but not least, the World Psychiatric Association Child Adolescent Psychiatry section, Norbert Skakauskas, who will also be joining us, along with our 3 speakers in the panel at the end with questions. Now, you all can see your Q&A segment. I hope that as you start to listen in, please put in questions, comments, and queries that you want the panelists to discuss. We'll be happy to take it at the end of the program. Now, let me just start by making a few opening remarks. I did say that trauma is important, but why stand against infant, child, adolescent trauma? And I'm going to share from something that Sandra Bloom in Philadelphia has shared with me as part of our team in trying to understand trauma-informed care. Let me read this to you. What if violence were no longer attractive? What if parents and adults stopped hitting, humiliating, disrespecting children? What if bullies were taught how not to bully others beginning in kindergarten? What if the media stopped slinging gratuitous violence at us through every possible venue? What if there was no glorification of people hurting other people? What if they called for war and nobody came? What if we devoted ourselves to become emotionally intelligent? What if all children have a safe, secure, reliable, and loving attachment figure to help them learn how to manage their emotions? What if children were taught from the very beginning not to control, suppress, or express their emotions, but to manage all their emotions? What if everyone learned the ways in which their emotions could be manipulated and played upon from their earliest years? What if we learned from our mistakes? What if everyone expected to continue learning and growing all the time throughout their lives? What if we remembered what we had forgotten? What if we found much better methods for making far better decisions? What if social responsibility was the norm for everyone? What if we recognized that our desire to punish is largely a desire for vengeance, not justice? What if we helped each other effectively manage our desire for revenge and transform it into something of mutual benefit instead? What if we recognize that the only thing that sets humanity apart from the other forms of life we share on this planet with is the power that we have to decide whether to be part of the problem or part of the solution? What if we are able to honor our losses while still intentionally creating our future? What if we grapple with the tragic nature of human existence instead of always looking for someone or something to blame? What if we really learn to let go and move with the flow of life? What if we actively sought out joy, love, fulfillment, and contentment as goals of life? What if we didn't stand against infant, child, and adolescent trauma? So with that, our first speaker for today is Denis Ugrin. He's from Ukraine, but currently practices in the UK. He is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist and a professor at the Queen Mary's University in London, and also a visiting professor at the King's College London. He's going to speak to us on children and the war in Ukraine. Denis, over to you.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and for the introduction and for your kind words as well. Can people see my slides now? Great.
We can, but you could put it into presentation mode.
Yeah, that's exactly what I intend to do. All right, look, thank you so much for all of you who had the time to join in on a Sunday. It's an unusual day, I think, for most countries. So I'm very grateful for people who have sacrificed their Sunday for this talk. So just start by showing you this picture of Marc Chagall. It was actually done in 1942, believe it or not, but really could have been done yesterday. Just to orient people who are less familiar with this part of the world, Ukraine by territory is the largest country within Europe. And before the war, it had a population of around 42 million people. It's a very diverse country, not just Ukrainians and Russians, but also Crimean Tatars live there, Hungarians, Jews, Poles, many other nationalities and ethnicities. In terms of the mental health in Ukraine, then we do have fairly good data on the mental health of adults in Ukraine. It is similar to what you would expect in most European countries, with perhaps a couple of differences. One is the prevalence of alcohol-related disorders, which is greater in Ukraine. About a quarter of men are affected by this, and then a slightly higher prevalence of mood disorders in women. Suicide was above average in Ukraine before the war, and you can see on this slide, this is just for COVID, that Ukraine was one of the countries that had increasing number of suicides. That was in 2019. The reason for this is almost certainly to do with the cessation of the first invasion of Russia, which happened in 2014-2015. As many of you will know, typically during the times of war, suicide goes down very substantially, but then increases after the times of war, which is exactly what we saw in 2019 in Ukraine, and which we will undoubtedly see after the cessation of this phase of the war. In terms of the structure of suicides, then again, most people will know that typically the older you are, the greater your risk of suicide. with two exceptions. One is females in the Southeast Asia, which is the graph you can see on the upper left-hand side there. There is a rather unusual to the bimodal distribution of suicide in Southeast Asia, with a lot of young women and girls killing themselves, then a decrease in middle ages, and then a predictable increase in old age. The second exception is Eastern Europe, which includes Ukraine, and there in males, and there you can see that there is a very steep increase very early in life in suicides in boys and young males, and then hardly any differences, and then a predictable increase at the end of life. Be fair to say that mental health services for children were in a state of transition before the beginning of the war. This is my hometown called Lviv, and you can see on the right-hand side there's a rather beautiful psychiatric hospital there, with many thousands of patients still in there, including children. And then on the left-hand side, you can see what was happening before the war, with the development of really quite nice community services for children, services that would be compatible with most healthcare systems in the world, and perhaps better than many others. In terms of the budget, then again, like with many other countries, child psychiatry was very heavily underfunded in Ukraine, and whatever funding was there was spent primarily, unfortunately, on inpatient services. It was changing, but slowly, and we really hope that after the war, one of the important things that should happen in Ukraine is the further development of community mental health services, including for children. Some of the other problems in Ukraine, like with many other similar countries, are difficulties with access and stigma. Again, I have to say that stigma is something that has been reducing in Ukraine the last few years, very, very dramatically. We see this now in soldiers as well. Something that was unthinkable about one of my friends who was badly injured on the front line is currently in rehab, and he's drawing with his left hand. He's right-handed. Beautiful drawings, and posts them on Instagram and Facebook, and talks about how important art is in his rehabilitation for his mental health, which is something that was unthinkable even 10 years ago, I think. Like with many other Eastern European countries, we have this sort of very top-heavy system of child mental health and mental health in general, unlike, for example, Western European pyramids, where you have a lot of community care, including in the primary care services. In Ukraine, it is not like that. It actually still remains very top-heavy, something that we need to be thinking about and changing. Some of the advantages of the system is that, unlike, for example, in the UK, the waiting lists are really non-existent, more or less. It's something that a lot of refugees who come from Ukraine to the UK really find very surprising, how underfunded and limited our services are in the UK. The same is true about investigations. Again, waiting for months and months for an MRI, for example, is unthinkable in Ukraine. Now, in terms of some other differences, which I think most of you who work with Ukrainian refugees probably should be aware of, is that there are real differences in, for example, parenting practices in Ukraine. I think, unfortunately, physical punishment is more common in Ukraine than it is in the west of Europe. Again, that is something that is improving in general and becoming less acceptable, but still is more prevalent in Ukraine. Ukrainian children also, by and large, are significantly more independent in comparison to West European children. In Ukraine, for example, children would be allowed to travel by themselves at a much younger age than in the west of Europe. Something that I really need to explain to the families who arrive in the UK about the differences in supervision expectations. Another important aspect of Ukrainian mental and physical health care system is the presence of these awful places called internats. They're like children homes and homes for people with disabilities. If you've ever been to one of those, either in Ukraine or in other countries, you will never forget them, that they are really awful places. Again, fortunately, they were becoming less prevalent in Ukraine. Many of them are being transformed and reformed, including children's homes. But again, the pace of that process is relatively slow, and it's something that we need to be thinking about in the post-war rebuilding. As many of you will know, since the beginning of the war, there was a massive population movement from Ukraine, within Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. I have to say that Poland in particular has been incredibly helpful for Ukrainians and opened their doors to millions of people, including children. It's something that we should never forget. You can see that since the beginning of the war, Russians were targeting specifically mental health and health facilities in general, especially in the last few months. And you can see that there is a significant destruction of the health facilities in Ukraine, especially in Kyiv and other major cities, and especially in the east of Ukraine. The initial onslaught in March 2022 saw the bulk of the destruction of our health care system. You can see that towards the end of the year, it tapered down, and then unfortunately in the beginning of this year, there was another onslaught with rockets fired and civilian infrastructure being specifically targeted, like, for example, this hospital here with one of British ambulances. Many, unfortunately, children have been killed. We think that approximately 461 children have been killed by the Russians so far, as confirmed by the UN. We are certain that the actual number of these children is significantly higher than that. And we see a lot of children with significant injuries too, including amputation, something that I have not seen in this number before, and they present a particular challenge in terms of rehab. This picture was taken by a friend of mine who is a BBC correspondent in a Polish city called Przemyśl, which is right on the Ukrainian border. It's a very interesting picture. It's a little boy from the east of Ukraine whose father was killed by the Russians. And you can see that him and his two sisters have just arrived. He's actually 13, but looks significantly older than that. And interestingly, you can see that the sisters are looking at him, even the older one. In some families in the east of Ukraine, there is this idea that males should take more responsibility than females, and you can see it here in this rather poignant picture. The picture on the left, I took myself. It's a little girl from Mariupol who escaped with her sister and mum and her cat. You can see that the cat looks significantly more stressed than the girl, and it's something that we've seen so many times where children come with their animals, and their welfare needs to be considered too. On the right hand side, we can see a boy again in Przemyśl. I forgot which city he was from, but you can see, if you look carefully, that he's got his little pet rat in a sock there, which is really quite a cute picture. In terms of the response to all of these children affected by the trauma, we have a nice consortium of people who do trauma work around the world. We had a meeting in Warsaw last year, and one of the things that we are focusing on is how to deliver digital interventions really to these children. There is categorically no way that any country could have enough therapists to provide individual one-to-one support for all of these children, not even in group sessions, I don't think. So we do need to think globally about supporting these children, how to generalize and how to digitize what we have to offer. WHO has been helpful as part of the Pan-European Mental Health Coalition. A lot of attention has been given to Ukraine. Some of the meetings were specifically aimed at developing community services in Ukraine. We have a grant currently under consideration in the UK looking at further evaluation and development of mobile mental health teams which deliver mental health care to those people who cannot access traditional mental health services, including those territories that were devastated by the war and those territories where children have no access to care, especially rural areas. Moving on to the UK, we have about 30,000 children in the UK from Ukraine. I have to say, I'm so amazed at how resilient many of these kids are. I must have seen several hundred children now from Ukraine in different ways, in groups, in schools, in scout camps, and be fair to say that the number of children who are significantly affected by the war is relatively small, in fact, surprisingly so. And most children seem to be coping exceptionally well despite moving from Ukraine to a foreign country, losing many of their links and connections. Yeah, it's something that is amazing to behold. One of the things we do to support children in the UK is, well, we do a number of things which I'll tell you a little bit more about, and something that perhaps other people might consider in your own countries. One of those is we've got a wonderful little book called The Rucksack. I don't know if I have it here somewhere, but it's basically about a girl and a boy who travel from Ukraine to the UK, and then the boy loses his rucksack, and then they're going back to Ukraine and collect his memories back into the rucksack. It's a therapeutic book written by a wonderful children's writer called Di Redmond, and illustrated by a Ukrainian illustrator from Zaporizhia. Again, very beautifully done. It also comes with a small brochure with some ideas for parents and grandparents of these children in terms of how to deal with some of the symptoms of trauma in these kids. I have to say that the book is very popular. Kids love reading it, and they ask very good questions after these presentations. We do have children who, you know, are affected by the war. When I think about the children who are significantly affected by the war, then they really fall into two main categories. Either children who had some pre-existing disorders, like anxiety, autism, ADHD, and so on, or children who experienced unspeakable, unthinkable trauma, such as rape by the Russian soldiers. So these two groups seem to be especially affected when we see them, and it's illustrated in some of their art. Over the summer, we had a wonderful program for children from a Saturday school. If you know, London is sort of in the west part of the city, in a place called Holland Park. The school has been there for many decades, a Saturday school, and since the beginning of this phase of the war, then there's about 1,000 children who go to that school on Saturdays in three different locations. So we screened these children, took 20 25 most affected children to do art over the summer in collaboration with local artists. We had 5 or 6 sessions of art. You can see here one of the things kids were doing were t-shirts, designing their own t-shirts. Actually, have a T-shirt designed by one of the children as well, who gave me as a present. Very proud of. The boy on the right here is interesting. You can see his T-shirt, very clever. So he spent a lot of time in Mariupol in the underground, and because of the nature of the devastation of the city, he actually thought he was going to die, that he would not be able to leave that that underground shelter. But fortunately, he was rescued. And you can see that his T-shirt is basically a description, a portrait of what he saw for many weeks when he was hidden in the underground shelter. And then in the middle of this, he also drew London Underground symbol, which is quite a clever, I think, play on this, on his experience. One of the other sessions was we were creating magic gold keys with children, so they were supposed to cover them with gold paint and put them in a beautiful little parcel, like this little girl here. And then we were telling these children, look, these keys are very special, they are magic, they bring good luck, and keep them under your pillow, or give them as a present to somebody. And this little girl came to me and said, oh, you know, my little key is actually already working, because my dad, who was fighting on the front line, is actually going to join me and my mom. So the magic is already happening. It's very sweet to see. This is what children think the victory is going to look like. This is Mariupol again. Two sisters from Mariupol who envisage the rebuilt city in this way, with lots of happy people, and what they remember of their shops and other facilities there. One other thing we do with children is groups. If you have not heard about teaching recovery techniques, TRT, it's well worth investigating. The training is short, about 2 days, basically 3 days sometimes, if we put some parenting in. If you're interested, I could put you in touch with the Children in War Foundation, who are the authors of this program. They typically are very happy to share their materials, and the training is free as well. The program was developed for the Balkan Wars in the 90s and has been used in many conflict zones and disasters over the last few decades, including in Ukraine. It was brought to Ukraine in 2014 during the first phase of the invasion, and Professor Bill Yule, who is the key author of the program, actually came himself and trained the first group of people in Ukraine. The basics of the group is essentially it's 5 groups for children, and each group is dedicated to dealing with a particular aspect of trauma. As most of you know, the CBT idea about trauma is that the child has poorly integrated memories of what happened, and then they have intrusive reminders like memories, nightmares, flashbacks, and so on. Because they're quite disturbing to the child, often the child is trying to avoid and repress these phenomena. In the short term, that of course is helpful. In the long term, of course, typically it is unhelpful, and the more children suppress these phenomena, the more difficult they are to manage. The principles of the groups are based on CBT, so the idea that thoughts, memories, feelings, behaviors, and physiology of the child are all linked together. We do about 10 to 15 children per group, sometimes much smaller. They need to be 8 years and above, about the same developmental level. We always have 2 group leaders in case a child becomes very upset, needs to leave, which actually happens very rarely. And we try to do this in informal settings, like schools, but not in the actual classroom, but in a nice sort of area somewhere outside of classrooms. in terms of the what has been done since the beginning of the war, we have now trained 524 people, and 150 of them actually deliver groups at the moment in Ukraine and elsewhere as well. You can see the numbers in different areas of Ukraine, also in different countries. I must say that when it comes to younger groups, we do see quite a few boys, but in older groups, very often we only see either just girls or very few boys there too. It's an interesting phenomenon, which we're trying to see how we could deal with this. I think it's not just a problem for Ukrainian boys, but for many boys and men in general. Yeah, a lot of creative stuff goes on there, but as many of you know who do trauma work, the key idea is to allow the child to process what happened, consolidate it as a standard memory, and then be able to explain to people without fear what happened. We often ask people to draw. It's something that children really like doing. Probably of all media, drawing is probably by far the most preferred for children. And as you know, we try to use any modality available to us to make sure that the child processes what happened to them and creates a story, a narrative of what happened, as opposed to having these sort of disjointed, scary bits of memory, which often they do have. An interesting challenge, as you probably know, with your work, if you do this work, is nightmares. Very often children have nightmares to do with what happened to them in Ukraine, but also about their fears about the future. I think by far the most common nightmare I encounter in kids from Ukraine is the fear that Russians will come and kill everybody in London. What we do with this is very often we try to reimagine the end of the nightmare so that it has a good ending. And very often we invite children to imagine a superhero that will, or somebody powerful, or benign from their environment, who can come actually and protect the child or people in London. And I was so amazed, that by far the most commonly used superhero by these people is actually President Zelensky, which is something I did not expect. I did not vote for him. I thought he would be a disaster, and I was very, very wrong. Obviously, he turned out to be the best possible, I think, leader for our nation. The other interesting difference between our Ukrainian children who are in London and, say, other refugee groups, which we saw recently from Afghanistan and from Syria, is that for some reason Ukrainian children very often are scared of trains. I couldn't really figure out what it was about trains. We didn't see this in Afghan children, Syrian children so much. I thought it was to do with the fact that the Russians were targeting railway stations and trains when they were escaping, but I don't think that is the case. That there is something about the sound that the train makes that upsets them very badly. And the other difference is they don't seem to be scared of uniforms, something that we saw in many children from other conflicts. We took about 150 of them to a scout camp, although even the ones who were not scouts in Ukraine, where everybody was wearing uniforms. We thought it would be a disaster, but actually they didn't seem to mind uniforms. And in general, they don't seem to be scared of military uniforms of any kind, which is different. We have 2 sessions for children, for parents as well, and a lot of this is psychoeducation. And really, the 2 key messages for parents that we give, one is the importance of routine. It's something that a lot of parents seem to under-recognize as a really important thing, is predictability and the routine for the child. very often they want some sort of exciting things and different things, and we recommend predictability, at least in the short term to begin with. The other very important thing which we discuss with parents is the importance of allowing the child to talk or process what happened whenever the child is ready to do so. We often have in parents these two extremes. One extreme is not to talk about what happened, especially if it was something very horrible, for fear of upsetting the child. And the other extreme is to make the child, to force the child to speak about what happened. We try to balance these two extreme views, but discuss with parents the importance of allowing the child to speak whenever they want to speak, and providing the supportive environment for the child when they want to process. And we have data on a lot of children now in Ukraine and other countries. You can see this is just the total number of kids who provided some data for us. It's in thousands, and just over 1,000 now in terms of parents as well. We know that most of the time tak means yes in Ukrainian, and ni means no, and частково means a little bit. So tak, whether they liked it or not, you can see most, like 90% of kids, like these sessions. And I must say, when we do ask about feedback, the number one thing that kids tell us, especially teenagers, that it's so important to see the support of other kids, and understanding that they're not alone, that other kids go through very similar experiences. The other thing is in itself a very important thing. About 1% of kids do not like these sessions at all. And in terms of what happens to the symptomatology, then very often it reduces very dramatically from the beginning to the end of the sessions. You can see intrusi, that's intrusions on something called the CRISE 8, going down by about half, and avoidance by about a third. Of course, we cannot say that any of this is to do with the actual intervention. It may be just the passage of time. So we do need to do a little bit of work in Ukraine on this. In fact, we are planning a cluster randomized study in a place called Ternopil, where we will train half of the schools in TRT, and the other half we will train after 6 months to see if there is an effect. We do know that there is an effect in other places and countries. There is no doubt about that. But the difference in Ukraine is that it has never been done in a country with active warfare. All of the evidence applies to kids who were in the place of safety, whereas we are very interested to see what happens, first of all in Ukraine, second of all when children are still unfortunately unsafe. They have air raids pretty much every day. So there's lots of stuff in the UK that we do for these children. Typically speaking, families are a lot more religious in Ukraine than say in the UK. So the importance of church is very important. They do like to join with all kinds of youth groups, like scouts, and after school activities, football, and stuff like this. And typically speaking, a lot of kids like engaging with these social things. And in London, we have loads. If in your countries you don't, then it's something that I really recommend that your local government invests in. I think providing social support is probably by far the number one thing that any government could do. For people to feel not isolated and connected to each other and to their culture. Yeah, a lot of families have been welcomed by UK families, which again we are exceptionally grateful for. So with that, I'm going to finish just to thank people like UNICEF and the Children's War Foundation who have been funding a lot of our efforts, and we really would like to thank people around the world for supporting Ukraine in this most difficult of times. And I really hope that when the war ends, hopefully soon, that we will rebuild better. We will not just recreate what was there before the war, but actually rebuild better. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll stop my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And we'll take questions. I believe you can ponder on the question someone asked about TRT while we move swiftly to our next speaker, which is Professor Fusun Chetin. Let me share the screen. And Fusun is a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the Hacettepe University School of Medicine in Ankara, Turkey, as well as honorary president of the Turkish Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, as well as vice president of the International Society of Adolescent Psychiatry and Psychology, and the founding member of the policy division of the European Society on Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And Fusun is a dear friend of WICAMHD as well. And Fusun is going to share with us the trauma from another kind of problem, a disaster, earthquake, traumatization of children and adolescents on multiple levels. Fusun, please.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. And I would also like to thank you for the leaders who organized the Second World Day for Infant, Child, and Adolescent Mental Health. It's an honor for me to take the place here. So I'm going to talk about the earthquake in Turkey, in traumatization of infants, children, and adolescents on multiple levels during this disaster. The February 6 earthquakes of 7.8 and 7.5 magnitude, followed by more than 7,500 aftershocks and 2 additional earthquakes, have resulted in the largest such disaster to hit the country in over 80 years. And we have inflicted the severest damage in 12 provinces in southern and eastern Turkey. This is a picture of a building of 7 floors, which, just sank into the earth. Oops. The devastating earthquake killed more than 45,000 people, rendered 1.25 million homeless across dozen cities, and caused immediate damage estimated at $30 billion, or roughly 4% of the country's annual economic output. More than 20,000 people are disabled, mostly because of injuries and amputations, many of which are children and adolescents, unfortunately. Expenses of orthesis and prosthesis is much above the amounts which can be covered by health insurances now. Turkish Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and National Associations for Pediatricians, Psychologists, and Social Workers started working at the region right after the earthquake in tents and in containers under the organization of Ministry of Health. Turkish Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry provided humanitarian support through the donations from members and supporters of child mental health. And association sent basic living needs to the region, as well as toys, books, and stationery for the children located in the tent villages. Association also provided services to support the child and families in the region for their mental health. 150 members, right, in the first week of the disaster volunteered for working in the field, and which they still continue doing. And more than 250 members now are working online and giving support to the families and children 7 days, 24 hours. Ministry of Health and Department of Special Needs organized the logistics, traveling, and safety for the teams going to the field, and arranged tents for them to stay and to meet with those who need help. 14 online seminars on treatment approaches in disasters organized for professionals. An online system is formed to give immediate mental health support, and increasing number of members are still working online. Brochures for handling children in disasters were prepared and distributed to families in the region to support the mental health children and adolescents. A well-equipped container is provided for a CAP department in Kahramanmaraş, and the association also participated on a platform called We Will Get Well Together, formed by several NGOs working in the field. And there is also a project now which will be funded by a Turkish philanthropy fund in USA to build a child wellness center for the children who had amputations. And Turkish association also partnered in this project to support the mental health of the amputated child. And this is really a big challenge for us all working as professionals. So many kids lacking, losing their extremities or parts of their bodies, and many are without any families now. Social consequences of the earthquake is enormous. The local economy was destroyed almost totally. The region has been rich in agriculture and livestock, most of which is damaged and killed by the earthquake now. And many people are now invalids or unemployed. In addition to housing, many schools, universities, hospitals, and other facilities have been destroyed or damaged and rendered unusable. And millions of people have lost their family members, homes, jobs, possessions, their hopes for the future, and for some is a reason for living too. What happened to infants and children and adolescents? The total number of children that is under 18 living in the 12 provinces before the disaster was about 5 million. And I cannot imagine any children who is not affected by this disaster, perhaps except only the infants who might have securely saved by their families and continue living in a safe place. The number of children orphaned is enormous. We don't know the exact numbers yet, but the estimations is really too big. Many injured children, after being rescued from the ruins, had to be sent to hospitals in nearest cities because many medical centers in the disaster zone have fallen or are damaged too. Adana City Hospital became a rescue hub for the region. There are hundreds of unidentified children whose parents are dead or untraceable still. Ministry of Social Affairs made a call for families to foster the unidentified children as many as possible. Many unidentified 0 to 2-year-olds were handed to their families after DNA tests from the hospitals, but there are still many children taken under care by the government, or some got lost. Unfortunately, the earthquake not only broke their homes, but it has also taken away their names. Turkish social media has been filled with posts showing missing children, giving details of which floor they lived on in collapsed buildings, expressing hope that they may have been rescued and taken to hospital somewhere. Surviving relatives and the health ministry officials have been traveling between medical centers trying to find them. Some have been reunited with their families, but the rest remain the earthquake's anonymous children. Like this baby girl in the intensive care unit with an anonymous tag on her bed. And this mother and daughter were united in a hospital after 2 weeks from the earthquake, each having an extremity amputated as a result of the crush syndrome while they were under the collapsed building. The mother lost his left arm and the girl lost his left leg. So the infants, children, and adolescents are not traumatized only by the experience of the terrifying earthquake, but also by many abrupt losses. Their homes, toys, and other possessions, family members, and relatives are all gone. And they lost their schools and friends, and some even lost their body parts. They have to go through the process of grief along with the anxieties, fears, and efforts to survive. So it's really a multi-level traumatization. Trauma of the ones who had to stay under the collapsed buildings till rescued is unimaginable. That's another level of trauma. Some had to spend days under the ruins with the dead bodies of their family members lying by their sides. We had a girl in our hospital who had to stay 5 days with the dead bodies of her parents and a sibling. And first, she tried to call them by names, and but when she saw that there is no response, she understood they're all dead, and she had to stay with them till she was rescued. And some are left with guilt feelings, much more than just survivor's guilt, actually. Another child was telling her story as such. When the earthquake happened, the family was trying to get out of the house. The mother ran out and the child was the next, but he couldn't skip the step out of the door and fell down. And coming back from her was her father and brother, and they fell on top of her. And then one of the rooms of the walls of the room crashed and fall on top of the father and brother, and they died. But their body prevented the child from dying, and she kept alive and finally rescued. But she was feeling so much guilty and always saying that, it's my fault that I felt. If I didn't fall down, my father and brother wouldn't be dying. And this feeling of guilt will be something that she will be carrying on all her life, perhaps. And they had to stay in hunger and thirst under the collapsed buildings, waiting to be rescued or waiting to die. It's really, incredible. I mean, one can't. They are thinking about the condition. And this little girl, they were rescued from the ruins, but was still asking repeatedly the same question after several weeks after the earthquake. Are we going to die, Dad? Are we going to die? So there are several mental health consequences of such disasters. Developmental, psychological, and psychiatric. But I think the developmental consequences are the most important for the age group that we are working with, because this multi-level trauma may affect the shaping of their brain structures and the forming of various circuits and networks in brain, depending on the environment and conditions they will be living in, and by the way they will be handled and treated by the caretakers, of course. But the trauma will shake their sense of basic trust to the world and to life on a great probability, and disturb their secure attachment patterns by the abrupt loss of parents, and affect their bondings in relations in the future, and can cause disruption in emotion regulation and self-regulation development, thus decreasing the regulatory capacities in later life, and disturb their cognitive development with severe effects, especially on memory and attention, and affect development as well, and create a big challenge for the development of a positive body image, especially for adolescents and for those who are injured or amputated. Obviously, all children at all ages show some psychological reactions to traumas or to disaster conditions, but their reactions differ from according to their ages. Infants may become irritable, difficult to calm down, cry more, change their eating and sleeping habits, and they will be affected mainly by the reactions of the parents or other adults around them. If they are secured safely by their families, they may not be traumatized unless the caretakers are traumatized a lot to the degree of not giving good enough mothering. If they had a severe physical injury affecting their physical or cognitive development leading to some handicaps, long-term physical or mental rehabilitation will be required. If left unidentified for a long time, this may become an issue unconsciously affecting the development of their sense of identity and sense of self in adolescence. Preschoolers, the ones between 2 to 6 years of age, show different reactions. Regressive behavior like wetting, starting to wet again, and excessive clinging and fear of being alone, sensitivity to loud noises, irritability, hyperactivity, eating and sleeping problems, and new fears can be observed. And they show reactions to loss in 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I will mention those stages if we will have some time. And if these reactions to loss cannot be resolved, they may affect the emotional development of the child in later years too. Calming attitudes of the adults and keeping up with daily routines are very helpful for this age group. Okay, yeah. What do we see in the face of loss? The first stage is called the denial. The first stage consists of refuse to believe what was happened. During this stage, children sometimes make believe that the loss has either not occurred or pretend that everything is fine. The second stage is anger. Once a child has stopped denying that the trauma has occurred, anger often follows. Anger can manifest itself in many ways, ranging from blaming others for the loss to turning anger inward and blaming oneself. Bargaining, the third stage, is anger then fades into attempts to bargain the trauma away. Children resort to this emotional strategy with the hope of removing the reality of what was happened. The next stage is becoming the permanent. Sad feelings set in. This is often the most difficult stage, and the children appear in depression. Acceptance and resolution is the final stage, and during this stage, the child accepts the loss and can move on with his or her life. With the resolution of the loss comes increased energy, renewed goals for the future, and return to previous level of function. The reactions of the school-age children is more in the form of non-specific physical complaints, appetite changes, sleep changes, sadness, withdrawal and isolation, irritability and acting out, and excessive fears and worry, agitation and apathy sometimes. Risk-taking behaviors can also be observed, poor concentration, disenchantment, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and new fears could come up. And of course, there is the challenge of adaptation to new routines because they are now out of school. Their daily life changed a lot. And that is also another kind of trauma. And they can also show reactions to loss. And children show the reaction to loss each stage at different times. Sometimes they skip a stage to come back to it later on. So, but it's important that the families to be aware of these stages that the child can go through, to understand them and to support them, of course. And adolescence is much different. Any injury or chronic sequelae like an amputation will affect the body image development, which will affect the self and personality development in later years. Deprivation from school life and moving to a new settlement will affect their social development and personal achievements as well. They can show acting out behavior, school refusal, aggressive behavior, sleep problems, anxiety symptoms, substance use as self-medication. Reactions to loss also can be observed. And psychiatric consequences of such disasters can be seen in these forms: bluntness of affect, loss of meaning of life and suicidal ideation, phobias, especially claustrophobia and fear of death, acute stress reactions, PTSD, relationship disorders, future life, anxiety disorders, depression, eating disorders, and substance abuse, especially in adolescence. No total data from the region was published yet by the government or by other institutions, but I would like to share the data of a small sample of patients we had at İhsan Doğramacı Children's Hospital of Hacettepe University. In 2 months, we had 82 children, infants, children, and adolescents admitted to our hospital. And only 2% of them were among 0 to 2 years. 20% were preschoolers, 32% were scholars, 38%, 46%, almost half, were adolescents. A female to male ratio was almost the same. And most of the 82 were outpatients. And the outpatient kids were almost all were brought by their families to the hospital. And both the children and the families, most of them, were not injured much and didn't have to stay under the collapsed buildings. And some of them were diagnosed with some mental disorder beforehand and were being followed up in the CAP departments in the region, and now they apply to our hospital outpatients, because Hacettepe Hospital, along with some other hospital, established outpatient clinic special to the people coming from the region, and they could just come in without any calls or any appointments beforehand. And we had 12 inpatients, which were severely injured, and all of them were sent from the regional hospitals, because Hacettepe is one of the referral hospitals. And almost all of them, not almost, all of them had to stay in under the collapsed buildings for some time. I mean, changing from a few hours to 5 or 7 days. It sounds really, unbelievable, but this is the reality and truth. And many of them had amputation before they came to our hospital because of the Christ syndrome they had while they were under the ruins. The teams who went there, the surgeons orthopedics, general surgeons, and others first tried to, save the extremities or the injuries by other methods, of course, by fasciotomy and other things. But those who didn't respond to fasciotomy and other interventions had to be amputated. And some of them had to undergo amputation after they were admitted to our hospital. And 18% of the total 82 were rescued from the room. So the kids really were in bad psychological conditions. And 10 overall, which is the 12%, had amputations. And the frequent symptoms that were observed were irritability, hypervigilance, eating and sleeping problems, and separation anxiety and clinging behavior, flashbacks, and for the outpatients mainly. And in addition to this, inpatients also showed more flashbacks and grief, crying, fear of dying, guilt feelings a lot, withdrawal, and depression too. Michelle is going to talk about the interventions, but I would like to mention a few points regarding the disasters, especially the earthquake, how to handle, how to help kids in, after such conditions. It's very important to create a feeling of safety. By emphasizing that you and other adults are doing everything possible to make sure that people are safe, secure, and free from harm, and that they will not be left alone, that the adults will be, caring for them. To be available is very important too when the children want to speak about their feelings, about the experience, or when they want to ask questions. And we should be very conscious about their ages, because each child reacts to disasters, as I mentioned, according to her emotional and developmental age. And each stage brings to a child a new understanding of the world and how events happen. Therefore, it is important to explain the events in words that a child can understand. Let them express themselves through play and art is another important intervention, actually, that we all know as professionals. Some children may not want to talk about feelings or fears, and especially for those, play and art works very well to express how they're feeling, and also to resolve their anxieties and fears through playing and drawing. And reframing is needed. The child, all the children, almost all the children actually, will receive information from peers and from the media. They are hearing the talks of the adults and other children around. And it will be good to ask the child about what he or she knows. If the child chooses to do so, let him or her explain his or her own words the earthquake and its effect. This will provide an opportunity to clear up any misinformation he or she had from the other people around, or misconceptions the child may develop regarding the things he or she heard or from her experiences. Education is required too, and you may need to provide explanation what are aftershocks, and that they will come fewer in number and less strong over time, and older children can be taught what to do in condition of aftershocks. And it will be important to provide children with the basic accurate information that they need. And avoiding details is good, as they will likely be upsetting or sometimes even increasing their anxieties. Reducing media exposure is another important issue. Minimize the child's exposure to media coverage of the earthquake. Viewing images or hearing descriptions of the earthquake and its aftermath will only heighten the child's anxiety. For example, a young child may not understand that media footage of collapsing buildings or distraught victims are replays of an event and may think that a new earthquake has occurred. Reaching out is important, talking about ways that the child can help other victims of the earthquake, and writing cards, sending drawings, or volunteering time can help a child contribute to the community healing process, and that will also increase their self-esteem and basic trust again. And of course, we as professionals and for infant, child, and adolescent psychiatrists especially, it's very important to get support for adults too, because most of the adults are highly traumatized after the earthquakes. And when they're traumatized, they cannot support their children's mental condition. So concerns, fears, anxieties of the adults should be shared with another caring adult. And we should also warn the parents or the adults not share their feelings or fears with the children. And sometimes we as professionals need to find people who can support such traumatized adults. And as you can understand, it's a very sad and unimaginable condition for all the people in the region, for all the people in the country, and for us professionals as well. And it's really a big challenge from different ways. How to take care of the both physical and the mental health problems of this group, a huge number of people. And we're trying to do our best as individual departments and also the Turkish Association, as I mentioned. And hopefully we will be doing as much as possible to cure the psychological injuries of children and adolescents from this surviving from this disaster. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fusun. And that must be a very difficult thing for you to have to experience. I think some of the questions ask about how we feel and whether it's even traumatized us as well, and something to think about during the panelists later on. I'm going to move us quickly because we're really short on time. Our next speaker is Michelle Miller. She's a social worker and also the Director of Mental Health Programs at the National Children's Alliance. She is previously with the Yale Child Study Center and has done a lot of work with traumatized children. And she's going to share with us her experience and this particular topic, evidence-based mental health response for child victims of trauma. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I'm honored to be here today and share information about evidence-based response to mental health in the United States. Let me just, I've got to adjust something here. Child abuse in the United States is common, unfortunately, similar to other places in the world. In 2020, there were 3 million referrals of abuse that impacted approximately 7.1 million children. And there was an average of 5 child fatalities per day. So what is National Children's Alliance? And I'm going to use a few acronyms as I go through. I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum. So National Children's Alliance, also referred to as NCA, is a membership and accrediting body for 939 children's advocacy centers across the US. We have chapters in every state to support CACs. NCA sets the accreditation standards that CACs must meet, and those standards are based on scientific evidence. All children, regardless of where they live, should have access to the same high-quality services. In 2022, CACs served nearly 390,000 children. Of those children, approximately 285,000 children needed mental health services, and 80,000 children per year are not able to access those mental health services due to workforce shortage issues. We have just developed a national institute. It's the National Institute for Better Mental Health Outcomes. And this institute is going to provide extensive training to professionals working within CACs. The institute plans to train thousands of professionals over the next 5 years so that all children in need of mental health services can access it. I have 2 diagrams here to illustrate what it's like for a child when there is not a CAC and what it's like when there is one. So the first one, as you can see, is disjointed. You have the child in the middle and you have professionals, but they're not coordinated in any way. CACs provide a coordinated multidisciplinary approach to child abuse investigation and response. If you look at the yellow illustration, you can see that the child is in the middle and the multidisciplinary team members rally around the child. And everything the child and family needs is in one place, and it's in a child-friendly environment. The multidisciplinary team members include forensic interviewers who are specifically trained to interview children who may have been the victim of abuse or had some other traumatic event, child welfare, law enforcement, prosecutors, medical, mental health, victim advocacy. The goal of the multidisciplinary team is to get justice for the child and to provide them an opportunity to heal from their abusive experiences. So let's talk about mental health and trauma. Nearly 50% of all US children, which is nearly 34 million children, have experienced at least one type of childhood trauma. Half of these children half of children have experienced 2 or more types of childhood trauma. Children served by children's advocacy centers that I'll refer to as CACs, who engage in mental health treatment, have an average of 6 trauma types. Some examples of the trauma types that children have include physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, domestic violence, community violence to include school shootings and racial violence, traumatic death of a loved one, severe car wreck, and natural disasters. Approximately 75% of children served at CACs can benefit from mental health services. Nearly a third of children reported having thoughts of hurting themselves within the 2 weeks of their CAC visit. So this makes it critically important for us to identify and address the needs of children who are coming through our Children's Advocacy Center. So child trauma can last a lifetime. We have plenty of research that demonstrates this. And so possible risk outcomes that carry into adulthood when children do not receive trauma treatment. The behavioral impacts can be a lack of physical activity, missed work, substance abuse. The physical and mental health risk outcomes that can occur, severe diabetes or severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted infections, heart disease, cancer, stroke, and it can be an early death as well. What I have in front of you now is a map that illustrates the mental health response that we are teaching our CACs. While all the steps are important, today we will focus on those outlined in red. It starts with step 1, which is screening for mental health symptoms. Screening does not require a mental health professional. Rather, anyone trained to administer a screener can do it. Training generally takes 2 hours and includes information on administering the screener, scoring it, and then sharing results with caregivers. We do not have enough mental health resources to refer all children who come through a CAC to mental health services. So screening is a critical step to determine the children who may be in need and those in greatest need if there are risk factors that are present. Step 2 is working to identify barriers to treatment engagement. We actually have a training initiative around this because what we've found is only 30 to 40% of children referred for mental health services from our children's advocacy centers attend their first appointment. And that percentage drops dramatically when we look at the number who successfully complete treatment. So we are training victim advocates on engaging children and families in mental health care to increase this number. Common barriers to treatment include the caregiver doesn't believe that their child needs mental health services, stigma around mental health, and cultural considerations. There are also the concrete barriers that can include transportation, money, time, and childcare. Evidence-based mental health assessment is another critical step. That's step number 4. And this is where a mental health provider administers an assessment to look for mental health symptoms and functional impairment and make the decision on whether or not mental health is indicated and what type of mental health services, which would be step 7. And then step 8 is we want to be able to answer the question, do kids get better? And when they graduate from treatment, we want to be there to celebrate that success with them. So I want to talk about what evidence-based treatment is. It's validated as effective and efficacious through a review of available evidence. It's manualized, it's time limited, generally somewhere between 12 and 20 sessions. It's consistent with trauma-informed principles. It's culturally informed. It involves caregivers. All of the evidence-based treatments that are recognized by our NCA accreditation standards involve caregivers. We know through research and experience that caregivers are essential to the healing and supporting of their children. It targets parenting practices, enhances safety, provides education on trauma and trauma symptoms, builds coping skills as well as other supportive and protective factors, and it allows the child and caregiver to process their traumatic experience. Training requirements for evidence-based treatments. In order to be trained to deliver one of these evidence-based treatments, it requires multiple days of training with a designated master trainer. Generally, it is 13 to 15 hours of training, depending on which evidence-based treatment the mental health provider is being trained in. It teaches mental health providers how to deliver the treatment with fidelity. Fidelity is important because if the treatment is not delivered as it was studied, then the outcomes may not be the same. So we really work with mental health providers to have that fidelity to the model. And then group consultation calls. Generally, there are 12 to 14 calls that are delivered over a 6-month period. And this gives clinicians opportunities to have support from their colleagues and the master trainer as they implement the evidence-based treatment. And then as they're going through implementation, having clinical supervision and support is also important. What evidence-based treatment training is not, going to a conference or a brief presentation and learning a little bit about it or what it is does not adequately train mental health providers to deliver evidence-based treatment. And web-based trainings only also do not provide adequate training when we're looking at that fidelity to the model. We know that evidence-based treatments work, and this makes us excited. We've spent the last decade working with our CACs and looking at the data that has come out of the research on evidence-based treatments. With the right treatment at the right time and in the right dose, Children do not need to endure this lifetime of suffering. 75% of children who received evidence-based treatment and had PTSD when they started treatment no longer met criteria at follow-up. So this graph shows the percentage of children who stopped experiencing these major life problems after evidence-based treatment, and include 78% no longer had inappropriate sexualized behavior, 57% no longer had alcohol or substance use or were running away from home, 56% were no longer self-injurious or experiencing suicidality, 33% no longer had behavior problems in school, 32% no longer had behavior problems at home, and 28% no longer had academic or medical problems. So I'm going to talk to you about an evidence-based treatment that's frequently used at our CACs. It's called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Nearly all of our CACs have access to trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy trained clinicians. And this is one of the treatments that we frequently offer training on. The number of scientific studies makes it the gold standard for trauma treatment. It is for children, adolescents, and their non-offending caregivers who are experiencing trauma-related symptoms. You will notice that there's the acronym in red, which is practice, and that sessions for this purpose, for the flow, are broken up by thirds. So we're going to start with the first third, which is generally sessions 1 through 4. As a reminder, TFCBT is generally delivered in 12 to 18 sessions. So the session numbers and the sections can change a bit depending on the number of sessions that a child receives, but it is considered to be a short-term treatment. So psychoeducation and parenting skills focuses on educating the child and family on childhood trauma, the effects of that, and when present, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. And for caregivers, skills on managing behavioral issues that may have manifested or increased due to the trauma. Relaxation skills aimed at calming distress for both the caregiver and the child. Affective expression and regulation is identifying feelings and normalizing conflicting feelings as they relate to the trauma and teaching children strategies to manage those feelings. Cognitive coping is identifying those automatic, unhelpful thoughts and teaching children that thoughts drive feelings and that they can be changed, and helping them through that process. The next third is the trauma narrative development and cognitive processing. Clinicians work with the child to tell their story. It is generally dictated by the child and written out by the mental health provider. For children who don't want to tell about their story, they can also use art and play, but we help them with their story. And we're looking for the details of the abuse. We're trying to reduce the avoidance as a way of managing their trauma symptoms through desensitization. Once they've created their trauma narrative, and even during the process of creating that trauma narrative, we start each session by rereading what they've done before. And the whole purpose of this is to continue to read it until they no longer experience trauma symptoms when they hear their story. The cognitive processing looks for cognitive distortions or thinking errors and helps the child to identify more accurate ways of thinking about the trauma. If we tell children it wasn't your fault when they're having the thought that it was their fault, that's not very effective for children. What we want to be able to do is we want to teach them to be able to explore the accuracy of that thought and for them to be able to change it on their own and recognize that it's not accurate. That is what is most helpful for children. Throughout the trauma narrative portion, clinicians have separate meetings with caregivers to share what's being developed, and this helps the caregiver understand the child's story and also allows them to have their own thoughts and feelings and process through that before their child shares that trauma narrative with them. Throughout, there is exposure by talking about the trauma. We actually start by talking about trauma in session 1. Again, we're working to avoid that avoidance behavior, and we want to increase mastery in dealing with their trauma symptoms. The last third, as you can see, starts with conjoint parent-child sessions, and this is where the child has the opportunity to share their work with their parent, share their trauma narrative, and their parent can, because the parent has already heard it and has worked through it, the parent can convey to the child that they're very proud of them and they can celebrate what the child has created. And then it ends with enhancing future safety for the child and for the family. I'm just going to talk quickly about another one of the evidence-based treatments. We're actually going to be doing large-scale trainings over the next 5 years. This is a brief model. It's an acute model. It's called Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention. And this is a training that we do in partnership with Yale University. It is a brief 5 to 8 session evidence-based early intervention treatment that is implemented soon after exposure to trauma or disclosure of trauma. This is an acute model that needs to start within 30 to 45 days and interrupts the development of PTSD. It is for children ages 7 to 18 and is based on a family strengthening approach. CFTSI increases communication between the child and caregiver and increases family support for children impacted by traumatic events. So the graph that you're seeing demonstrates for children before treatment, it's the red bar was in the clinically significant range for post-traumatic stress disorder. And after 5 to 8 sessions, you can see that reduced to the point of the child no longer meeting criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. The orange bar, this is for caregivers, and it shows that the caregiver was experiencing significant distress prior to their child's treatment. And after participating in CFTSI with their child, their stress dropped dramatically and they no longer had post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that parents have their own post-traumatic stress, and the great thing about both the TFCBT and the CFTSI is that what we've seen is by virtue of the caregiver participating in their child's therapy, that the parents' post-traumatic stress symptoms drop as well. And we know that if we can get parents to where they're able to address their own post-traumatic stress, that makes them more available for their children. This is just a list of the different evidence-based treatments that NCA recognizes. So for our centers to be accredited, they have to offer one or more of these evidence-based treatments to the children and families that they serve. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here today, and I want to thank all of you for your attention. Also, a big thank you for all that you are doing for the children around the world. Your work and dedication to children inspires me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I know that we really run out a little bit on time, but what I'm going to do now is going to ask the panel to come together and let's try and answer some of the questions that are in the Q&A segment. I think some are directly addressed to the speakers, and I wonder if we could, you could look at your question and just pull them out. Maybe we could start with Dennis. I think in the first part of the presentation, there's a bunch of questions.
Yes, thanks. Essentially, the questions were around where to get the resources. I've responded to individual people who requested this. There is a Children in War Foundation website, which one could request the resources from there. If anybody needs resources in Ukrainian, do put in the chat. I can also direct you to Ukrainian resources as well. The question about parents, said, I totally agree with the colleague who commented on parents. Without a doubt, it's very important. Probably we don't do enough with parents. Interestingly, sometimes parents don't come as well. So when we run these groups in London, parents of little children always come and really quite enjoy hanging around, drinking coffee and stuff like this. Mainly mothers. We hardly ever see fathers, partly because they are not allowed to leave Ukraine, partly because, as most of you know who do this work, it's 80 to 90% always mothers who come to these groups. But parents of teenage children don't come as often, and I think that we haven't found a really good way to engage them. And we would really like more parents to come, because as the colleague is saying, it's such a key thing. And when parents are more settled and feel better, that undoubtedly is one of the key things for the well-being of the child. So if any other sort of speakers have good ideas on how to engage parents and boys, it'd be good to know.
Yes, I was going to ask Fusun, because obviously Fusun was saying that, well, many of the parents get killed, right? But still, how does adult caregivers come including family members, into this process? And then maybe Michelle can talk a little bit about, because in your evidence-based treatment, you have these conjoined sessions for trauma-focused CBT, how that would be useful in that latter part. But maybe Fusun first.
Well, it depends, because, as I mentioned, with our outpatient children, they came in, most of them, with their parents. But with the inpatients, most of them without any families. I remember one kid, the only family member who could be found was a psychotic uncle. And this guy was there in the hospital, talking and increasing the anxieties and fears of the child, doing no good to him, but rather the harm. So we just decided not to let him in, but tried to find another relative. And finally, we got a faraway person and could get it to the hospital to stay with the kid. And even the parents of the outpatients, as I told, were not too much traumatized, so to say, or less traumatized, a better way. They are also traumatized, and they needed support, and they needed to get help, how to treat their children in those cases, and what to talk to them, what to say to them. And we spare extra time with these parents, and we also get some of them in groups to talk about the common questions and common problems. But it's since this earthquake happened so abruptly, again, we were not planned or ready to create or plan certain therapy systems, or but there are certain therapy educations or trainings going on in the country. There are people in our field who are really certified in doing CBT or other kind of, and EMDR and other kinds of trauma therapies as well, and along with the psychodynamic approaches. But we needed more people in the field. So that's why those groups who were given formal certification-based treatments in the country opened short-term training sessions for those professionals, for those members of the Turkish Association who will go and volunteer to work in the field. So they kind of received a short-term training, which is not certified, of course, but which will be at least helpful to them to help at a certain point to the people in their disaster region. And families were all traumatized too. I mean, at different levels, but they lost many members, and they lost their jobs, all their possessions. Some of them lost all their possessions, their land, their animals, and everything they had. So there were really people who were talking about not finding a meaning to live now,
So Fusun, I mean, what you're saying is that the basic needs, of course, needs to be addressed. But it's quite evident, I mean, in the two examples that Dennis and yourself have been describing, that some kind of urgent training might sometimes be needed for people to be ready to work with the families. And I wonder if Michelle, I mean, as part of planning provisions of the NAC, whether there's been sort of any thought into developing training that could be widely accessed quickly and, with the relevant mental health professional?
Thank you. So I know that for child and family traumatic stress intervention, Yale University has gone out to other countries and trained. So at this point, what we're doing in the United States, because we have a shortage, we also have a shortage of mental health providers, we have waiting lists. And so what we're starting with our institute is having training that is frequently available. So our children's advocacy centers can rely on several trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapies every year, also the child and family traumatic stress intervention. So that is going to be our strategy over the next 5 years, is to make the training very accessible. We're also hoping to be able to get the training in graduate programs so that hopefully when clinicians are going through that training, they can graduate and look to work with and for our children's advocacy centers.
Yes, and in fact, there was one question about prevention programs. I think part of that would be creating some kind of training even before potential traumatic events occur, if there were community resources in various communities, whether that could. I'm going to ask the rest to chip in now. Maybe we could start with Mario, because his computer is running out of energy.
Thank you very much. I'm really proud of being part of this initiative, and I think we have to be all together to support children, adolescents who are traumatized, but also professionals who are faced with so many difficulties for helping those children, adolescents. I would just would like to say one thing, that trauma is an individual and a collective social problem. So that's why I think it's very important, it's been underlined by many of you, that we have to work with children and adolescents, but we also have to work with all the environments that support the children. And without this part, children cannot find a way to be resilient. So we have really to work on the social network, environment, parents, but also, for example, in school, where we know that bullying is a major problem, to a second hit where children are already fragile. So my point is that we really need to look at the global environment, which include social policy, because we can't do all of this all alone. We need really to engage professional, mental health professional, but also be really advocating with policy and with governmental strategies.
Thanks, Mario. And what about Campbell Paul? Do you want to say something from a very young child, infant perspective?
Yeah. Thanks very much to Dennis and Fusen and Michelle and Mario there for your comments, and of course to Daniel and Lewis for getting us all here. But from the infant mental health perspective, I think much of what's been discussed is very pertinent and relevant, except that we need to understand that the infant, the very young child, has a different way of speaking, if you like. We need to listen to the voice of babies and very little children who haven't the capacity to draw or play in the way that we think they might be able to. But certainly from our work with infants across many countries over a long period of time, we know that infants are subject to trauma in very similar ways, similar sets of symptoms, although not expressed in words and deeds, pictures and the like. So, yeah, we need to listen to the infant's experience, and that means using the vehicle of the parent and the caregiver, or if the caregiver of the parent is not available, or if they've died in a tragic situation, as you have in so many countries now, the caregiver who is available needs to be there to support the child in speaking. So I thank the presenters very much. There is quite a bit of research and literature adapting, if you like, the methodologies downwards in terms of age for the victim of trauma, for the 0 to 3, 0 to 5-year-old group. My colleague Jodie Manley made mention of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in the States. It's got some really useful resources. But I just come back before I finish to Mario. I think we need to be part of collaborating with services that are on the ground, collaborating with UNICEF, collaborating with WHO, collaborating with UNHCR, because the immensity of the problem of childhood trauma, when you look at it worldwide, is just awesome. We have more refugees, more displaced persons now in the world than we ever have had before. So it means collaborating with people on the ground and adapting the sort of things that Michelle is talking about to make them available to people who don't have formal mental health training. That's a crucial thing for us to continue to do. So thank you very much, each of you, for an amazing set of presentations that leave you feeling stressed and traumatized. Thank you.
Thank you, Campbell. And Norbert, would you like to say something? There was one question about the medications and other types of therapies.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So first of all, I would like to thank Daniel and Luis, the WICAPHD past and current president, for leading this initiative on the World Infant, Adolescent and Child Mental Health. And today we are focusing on one very important topic, but in a way, this meeting is to mark the importance of mental health in these ages overall. So I think all the speakers emphasize traumatic experience, and Denise spoke about Ukraine, Fuzun spoke about Turkey, and Michelle summarized the therapy. But I think one thing we also have to emphasize, especially on this day, is the resilience, the post-traumatic growth. So there are two sides. I think it's important to say that we as professionals have a role to make sure that everything is done, that despite all very painful experience, the child, the family has a future, has a perspective. And I think this initiative, this Mental Health Day for adolescent, a child, and also infant, gives us that opportunity. So my message is that we also need to speak about the post-traumatic growth and how these families who experience and the kids experience these devastating events can also live and enjoy their lives after those events. So thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Norbert. And I'm going to leave the last word to our president, Luis Roda, to close us off. But before that, I think Mark, I can't remember the name of the questioner asked, what about us as we listen to all of this? How do we feel, and how are we? And I think it's important that we remember that it's less about, and I'm reminded about what Norbert says, it's less about what's wrong as it is also about what has happened and what can we learn through these experiences and be stronger and resilient as a result of it. And I think that's important for all of us. I mean, it's very sad to hear these stories. And these are just snippets of a host of other stories that are occurring around the world, even as we speak. So I'm going to leave the last point to Luis. Luis, would you like to say anything and sort of end us off? We'll try and put that slide up for you on that next meeting as well in Rio, where we can probably explore this in a little bit more detail.
First of all, I'd like to thank very much the three speakers, panelists, for the wonderful talks and to give us a little bit of the sense that what is happening in Ukraine, also in Turkey, and Michelle about evidence-based treatments in the US. For me, I think that one of the biggest challenge that we all face is how can we coordinate and develop a center, an international center, that to be ready to intervene whenever we have situations like the one in Ukraine and in Turkey. We need to work together to create the conditions to face these issues, and also to face violence and trauma in other areas. Here in Brazil, for instance, we will have next Wednesday to celebrate the day, talking about the type of violence and trauma that is children living on the streets. Also, that's a major problem in South American countries. So I think that we need to be ready to intervene and to deliver evidence-based interventions for this situation. So I thank you very much, the panelists. I thank very much all the co-sponsor associations that have been working with us to celebrate this Infant, Child, and Adolescent Mental Health Day. And we will continue discussing all these issues and a lot of other issues in the next World Congress of WICAPHD that will be in Rio, May 20 to 24. And I invited everyone to be with us in Rio and to continue our work in the benefit of our children and adolescents. And thank you very much for being with us in this webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody for their sympathetic words as well.
Thank you very much, Fusen, and Dennis in the midst of it all. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.